Let's talk specifically about how the men in this film are portrayed, because it is frankly bizarre. The male characters are written strictly in extremes. They are either blatant abusers or they are completely spineless passive cowards. Take Joseph for example. He is written as this hyper-passive, overly feminine sober archetype who refuses to argue. The movie seems to be pushing this incredibly cynical message that deep down, no matter what, all these men are exactly the same. He is ultimately no different from his abusive brother or his father. That is what the film is trying to say. And it's honestly a very wrong, heavy-handed message. Evil Dead Burn is officially the 6th installment in the legendary Evil Dead franchise. Let's just address the elephant in the room right off the bat. Evil Dead is arguably the only long-running horror movie franchise out there that is still consistently producing genuinely compelling films. We are in an era where legacy horror often feels tired or repetitive, but not this one. Not only are the hardcore fans loving it, but the audience numbers are actually increasing with each new release, which really says a lot about the top tier quality of the Evil Dead films we are getting today. I am a massive lifelong fan of the Evil Dead franchise. In fact, I completely credit this series with getting me into horror films in the first place. I still vividly remember that the original Evil Dead was the very first horror film I ever watched. To be completely honest with you, as a young kid, I thought it was pure unadulterated nightmare fuel. For a very long time, I legitimately thought of it as the scariest film ever made. It took me almost a decade to realize that it was actually heavy leaning into horror comedy. But hey, you can't really just blame me. I was just 10 years old at the time. My friends and I as kids used to sit around and talk about Ash Williams and his iconic chainsaw, sometimes just randomly reciting his one-liners to each other and obsessively discussing that legendary scene where he cuts off his own hand. Evil Dead was definitely a huge part of my childhood. Then fast forward to 2013 and director Fede Alvarez stepped up and gave his own brutal modern spin to the franchise. Fede's Evil Dead took things down a much darker, far more serious route. Looking back, I really think that gave the franchise a whole new lifeline. Yeah, I know it was a bit polarizing for some of the old school fans, especially for those who grew up on Army of Darkness and later watched Ash vs Evil Dead. Those fans know exactly what the classic Evil Dead stands for and just how much goofy, slapstick fun it can be. But even though I absolutely love the campy horror comedy aspect of the Raimi era, I still find that the modern 2013 film brought a much needed new perspective and a visceral freshness to the series. Honestly, that tonal shift might be the exact reason it is still so highly appreciated by fans today. Oh god, I just love this franchise so much. Then Lee Cronin's Evil Dead Rise came out recently and it worked so incredibly well that it brought a massive wave of brand new fans into the fold. I still remember sitting in the theater on opening weekend, and when that massive title card dropped on screen, the energy in the room shifted. We all collectively knew right then and there that this was going to be an absolute banger of a movie, and oh boy, a banger it was. One of the absolute best things about this franchise is that it allows every new filmmaker to bring their own bag of tricks and unique visual flair to the table. This is what keeps the franchise feeling fresh, alive and unpredictable. However, as any horror fan knows, this is also a double-edged sword. Sometimes a director's vision can be so incredibly unique that the movie almost stops feeling like an Evil Dead film altogether. Let's look at the core formula. Evil Dead is almost always about a scenario where someone somehow stumbles across the Book of the Dead, the Necronomicon, decides to read from it and accidentally unleashes an ancient evil that attacks them and turns their closest friends and family into demonic Deadites. Almost every Evil Dead movie shares this exact same premise. Sure, the group of people changes and the location might swap from a cabin in the woods to a high-rise apartment building, but the bones of the story can occasionally start to feel a little bit repetitive. Even though I'm thoroughly enjoying this modern era of films, the big question going into this review is this: is Evil Dead Burn way too unique to even be called an Evil Dead film? Does it still capture that signature chaotic charm? Does the formula feel repetitive this time around, or is that much needed freshness still there? To answer those questions, I've broken down some of the major positives and negatives of the film so that you can ultimately decide whether you need to rush out and watch it in theaters right now, or if it's something you should just wait to rent on VOD. Let's begin with the positives first. Whenever you hear the words Evil Dead, what is the very first thing that pops into your mind? I'm guessing it's blood, gore, and buckets of fake syrup. The Evil Dead franchise is world famous for its completely unapologetic over-the-top blood and gore. In fact, a lot of people forget that the very first Evil Dead film couldn't even get a traditional theatrical release in some places and was famously labelled a video nasty in the UK simply because of the excessive unrelenting violence. So one can easily say that the blood and gore is the beating heart of this franchise. Now Evil Dead Burn might not be the absolute nastiest or bloodiest Evil Dead film we have ever seen, but it is definitely up to the mark. I still personally feel that Evil Dead Rise has slightly more extreme gory set pieces, but Burn is right there creeping behind it. One thing I do need to mention, what it does have is animal cruelty. So please take this as your official trigger warning, especially for all the dog lovers out there watching this video. Other than that specific element, yes, there are some truly deeply violent scenes, but how they affect you really depends on your personal horror appetite. They are not necessarily gorier than Evil Dead Rise, and honestly, if you have recently survived extreme splatter films like Terrifier, the gore in Evil Dead Burn is going to be easy peasy for you. But yeah, there definitely are some intense moments where you are going to instinctively want to close your eyes or look the other way. The gory scenes and the violence here felt very grounded, realistic, and highly authentic, which makes it hit a bit harder. Next up on the positive list is the phenomenal camera work. Sam Raimi established this incredibly unique kinetic style of handling the camera and visuals in his original films. I absolutely love how he goes full 360 with the camera and how the lens in his films constantly moves up, down in wild frenetic circles or in high speed reverse to mimic the evil force. Director Sebastian Vanicek somehow managed to bring a very similar chaotic energy to Evil Dead Burn. There are some incredibly unique top angle shots where the camera is looking straight down at the characters from the ceiling, and honestly, those sequences felt like I was watching a high octane action film. First of all, they are very well choreographed. It almost felt like Sebastian was using this movie to audition for a massive action blockbuster. Second, the guy clearly knows exactly what he's doing behind the lens. Sebastian Vanicek is a French filmmaker, and he absolutely brought his French cinematic sensibilities to this project. If you watch international horror, you know that European sensibilities are very different from standard Hollywood conventions. For example, look at the way he shot the bar scene in the first act. I'm talking specifically about the birthday party scene that happens right before the accident. It feels very French. The moody way the color is utilized, the explicit and intimate shots of kissing, all of it combined gave the movie a distinctly European, gritty vibe. I'm not gonna lie, for a second there I genuinely thought I was watching a Gaspar Noé film. It borrows heavily from the new French Extremity movement, a subgenre known for being deeply visceral and psychologically aggressive. For example, there's a specific prolonged scene of two elderly people kissing each other with all that strange liquid involved, and that is exactly the kind of jarring, uncomfortable imagery you only really see in French cinema. I don't want to spoil anything for you guys, so I'm not going to go very deep into the details of that scene, but once you watch it, you will immediately understand what I'm saying. Vanicek proves here that he's a very capable, highly passionate filmmaker with a distinct voice. Finally, for this section, let's talk about the lore. Now, even though this is officially the sixth film in the franchise, the on-screen lore has actually been kept very limited lately. None of the modern films have really explored the deep lore of the Evil Dead universe, the way the original Sam Raimi films did, or the way the mythology was widely expanded upon in the Ash vs. Evil Dead television series. So it was very cool and highly refreshing to actually learn more about the Kandarian dagger. I still feel like the dagger was slightly underutilized in the grand scheme of the plot, but I give them massive props because at least they brought up something legacy related up. Otherwise, the modern Evil Dead films rarely explore the magical or historical lore other than simply referencing the Book of the Dead. I really wanted to know more about the history of the dagger, and maybe, just maybe, in the future we are going to get more of that world building. Alright, we have talked about the good, but now it's time to flip the page. Shall we move on to the negatives of the film? Because as much as I wanted to unconditionally love this movie, there are some seriously underwhelming aspects of the Evil Dead Burn that we desperately need to talk about. First of all, and this is perhaps the major turn-off of the entire film, there are absolutely no likable characters. Zero. And it's not like this film is incredibly fast-paced and simply didn't have the screen time to build up its roster. No sir, this is actually the longest film in the entire franchise to date. yet somehow none of the characters connect. You just don't find a single one of them likable or worth rooting for. Anytime anyone gets killed, you genuinely do not care. You don't care about the lead, and you couldn't care less about the side characters. For a franchise built on us aggressively rooting for a survivor, this is a massive problem. Let's talk specifically about how the men in this film are portrayed, because it is frankly bizarre. The male characters are written strictly in extremes. They are either blatant abusers or they are completely spineless passive cowards. Take Joseph for example. He is written as this hyper passive, overly feminine soy boy archetype who refuses to argue, just blindly listens to his wife and agrees with her on absolutely everything. But then when push comes to shove and his own father is literally trying to kill his wife, what does he do? He won't step in. He completely freezes and acts like a terrified little child. Yet strangely, when the time comes for him to kill his wife later on, he doesn't hesitate for a second. The movie seems to be pushing this incredibly cynical message that deep down, no matter what, all these men are exactly the same. He's ultimately no different from his abusive brother or his father. That is what the film is trying to say. And it's honestly a very wrong, heavy-handed message. You know exactly what I mean when I say Evil Dead Burn goes out of its way to portray men in a remarkably bad light. What I found especially weird about this creative choice is why they did it. It feels like the men were portrayed as irredeemably awful solely as a cheap trick to force us to sympathize with the female lead. But the funny part, she is still not very likable. Her backstory and her trauma felt completely half-baked to me. It felt less like a driving character motivation and more like an afterthought scribbled into the script at the last minute just to give her some artificial depth. Then you have Will, who is portrayed as your textbook insufferable male chauvinist. Is the arrogant show-off type who flaunts his money at every possible opportunity. There are dark hints of domestic violence. He genuinely believes he owns his wife and he treats her like his literal property. And when you look at his family dynamic, especially his father, you understand why he turned out that way, but it doesn't make watching him any more enjoyable. That's why I say the male characters are just fundamentally bad in this film, possessing absolutely no redeeming qualities whatsoever. Now let's take a step back. When you think of Evil Dead, what immediately comes to your mind? The Book of the Dead, the Necronomicon, is the absolute crux of the franchise. Without the Book of the Dead, Evil Dead is simply incomplete. Yet in Evil Dead Burn, you hardly see anyone actually reading from the book or even listening to the cursed translation on a creepy recording. The book itself is barely shown in a single fleeting scene. Similarly, Ash William wielding his roaring chainsaw is deeply engraved into the hearts and minds of the franchisee fan base. I firmly believe that without a blood-soaked chainsaw sequence, an Evil Dead film is incomplete. Without it, it just doesn't feel like Evil Dead. Fede Alvarez and Lee Cronin both made sure to include epic chainsaw sequences in their modern iteration because they fundamentally understood what Evil Dead is at its core. They respected the legacy. Here in Evil Dead Burn, there is absolutely no chainsaw sequence to be found, and as I mentioned, we barely even see the book. I totally understand that director Sebastian Vanicek was going for something unique here, but he tried so incredibly hard to be different that the movie didn't even feel like it belonged to the franchise. Ironically, he also tried to go back to the series' roots by injecting humor into the script. It's true that what modern Evil Dead films sometimes miss is the goofy, chaotic humor of those original Sam Raimi films. However, Sam Raimi Evil Dead films were true horror comedies. You can put them on the horror shelf or the comedy shelf at blockbusters and both placements would be 100% correct. Raimi's films were funny during the horror scenes. You know exactly what I mean. Terrifying supernatural things are happening on screen and yet the sheer absurdity of it still makes you chuckle. And for of course, a massive amount of credit for that tone goes to Bruce Campbell. His charm, charisma and unmatched goofiness are what made the franchise so incredibly popular. But those older films were meticulously shot and scripted in a manner meant to make you chuckle within the scary moments through brilliant situational physical comedy. Here Sebastian Vanicek tries to add humor, but he places it entirely in scenes where there is no horror. There are separate, isolated scenes for comedy and separate, isolated scenes for horror. They are never happening at the exact same time, which is the total opposite of the classic Evil Dead formula. The tone just ends up feeling disjointed. Then we have to talk about the Deadites. I really didn't like the Deadite design in this one, nor did I understand what they were actually doing in the film. First of all, I fundamentally do not understand why they were inflicting pain upon themselves. That breaks the established lore. Deadites don't do that. They are summoned here to torture, psychologically break, and ultimately kill the living characters, not to just kill themselves. I'm talking specifically about that scene with the father where he's holding a gun and just shoot himself in the head. It lacked that sadistic joy Deadites usually have. That scene is a prime example of why I keep saying it just didn't feel like an Evil Dead film. Then we get to the climax where we see a Deadite version of Will. His character design is without a doubt the absolute worst of the bunch. He literally looked like a CGI monster. Evil Dead is famous, legendary, even for its gruesome tactile practical effect. But here the main boss looked like an entirely digital creation, which instantly pulled me right out of the movie. Combine that with the fire in the background, which was also very obviously CGI, and the whole finale just looked so incredibly fake. And that right there is the core problem. Evil Dead Burn tries so many different things and pushes so hard for a unique identity that it sheds the identity of the franchise it belongs to. Don't get me wrong, it's not a terrible movie on its own. It's a decently good horror film. But the problem is that all the other films in the Evil Dead franchise are genuinely great. So by comparison, it falls woefully short. It just doesn't feel like it organically belongs in the Evil Dead universe. One more thing I really want to add before the wrap up is that the overarching formula is starting to feel a little bit repetitive now. Like I mentioned, I rewatched the entire franchise back to back recently while preparing for this review of Evil Dead Burn. While binging them, I definitely had the thought that the creators need to take some massive new routes soon. They are all structurally very similar. We are essentially just watching different groups of random people getting trapped and tortured by Deadites over and over again, and that repetition is finally starting to catch up with the series. However, there is a hope on the horizon. I don't know if it's officially true or just a very strong rumor, but word on the street is that the next movie, Evil Dead Wrath, which is supposedly coming out next year, is going to be set in the 1980s, taking place just before the events of the very first film. If this is actually the case, I'm more than interested to watch it. Maybe it will directly connect to the original cabin, the original tape recording, or even Professor. That would be absolutely incredible and exactly the kind of fresh connective tissue the franchise needs right now. But to summarize my thoughts on this latest entry, out of the three modern Evil Dead films, Evil Dead Burn is undeniably my least favorite. Personally, it just felt way too different to me. I mean, I didn't even like the opening scene where the victims were killed by completely random stranger Deadites. That's not cool. You know what's terrifyingly cool? When the characters get hunted and killed by their own possessed friends and family. That psychological torment is exactly what Evil Dead is all about. It's supposed to be intimately terrifying, not just about getting randomly slashed by a stranger. So what is the final verdict on Evil Dead Burn? Does it actually deserve a trip to the theater, or should you just save your money and wait to rent it? Honestly, if you are a die-hard horror fan who just wants to see some decent blood, aggressive camera work, and that gritty French Extremity flair, you might find some genuine enjoyment here. It has its moments, and as a standalone horror movie, it works fine. But if you are going in expecting the claustrophobic, chainsaw-wielding, delightfully chaotic madness of a classic Evil Dead movie, you are going to leave the theater feeling pretty disappointed. By trying so hard to be unique, it completely forgets its roots. The sheer lack of the Book of the Dead, the heavy reliance on the wonky CGI in the third act, and a cast of deeply unlikable characters easily make this my least favorite entry of the modern era. Because of that, for me, this is a definitive wait for VOD situation. Save your money, grab some popcorn on your own couch, and maybe just rewatch the 2013 reboot or Evil Dead Rise instead to get that proper Deadite fix. But hey, that is just my take. Now I want to hear from you guys. Do you think Evil Dead Burn pushed the franchise in a cool new direction? Or did you hate the CGI monster and the missing chainsaw as much as I did? And how incredibly hyped are we for Evil Dead Wrath next year? Let's argue about it down in the comments. If you enjoyed this review and want to see more horror deep dives, do me a huge favor and smash that like button. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future uploads. Until next time, stay groovy.